Agus. Agus, si es que me he encontrado con el bus.
No, pero lo que tenemos que hacer es la prueba de conexión con ella, la calidad de la conexión, que no se vea bien, que se oiga bien.
Hay más de 3 personas, ¿no? Y se van a conectar directamente.
No,
allá hablas con ellos,
una
¿no?
persona.
Es que se va a conectar antes de empezar.
Vamos a hacer prueba, ¿no? Es que corriendo para nada.
Es que no, es que falta. Es que alguien tiene que estar complicado con él para decirle.
Es que es todo el rato así.
Este hombre sabía que no, las dos hacíamos una prueba.
Ya. Eso no es un bicharraco.
Vale, no,
pero
esto no,
esto
ya es, no, esto es para llegar a Marte con esto.
La doble rueda daban.
Pero eso ya es un
Llavors d'això, depèn de la distància entre ejes, se considera
Sí, tiene como una Agus, avísame cuando sea que se conecta, Agus. Avísame a que se conecta. Activo el intercom, si que se conecta me llamas. Nada, que estamos esperando. No digo más que no nadie se conecta todavía. Así que esto es lo que ellos quieren, ¿sabes? Puedes mirar la imagen, ¿sabes? Puedes hacer el compositor de la imagen y nada. Así que bueno, yo sé que se va a conectar un momento ya. Sí, dime. Sí, solamente falta que se conecte para que se pueda chequear. Bueno, de todas formas está chequeado el audio, ¿no? Desde ayer, ¿no? Cuando chequeamos conmigo, ¿no? Ayer, ¿no? Sí, al final la arreglaste con la bus. Ya, sí. Más que de hecho, si puedo probar, ya me ha dicho que no, como está ya abierta ya la sesión, no puedo meterme ya ahora mismo. Bueno, a ver qué pasa. Crucemos los dedos.
Con eso no pasa entre los coches.
Eso lo pasas por encima.
Sí, es la putada, por la ascensión.
Hola.
He fumado cigarro, tío, y tengo el pecho un poco cogido. No, dejé de boxear, tío. Me saltó un colmillo haciendo sparring fuerte. Sí, lo único, bueno, por suerte era un Hola, 1, 2, 1, 2. You can hear me, please? Abre Zoom, a ver. A ver si habla. You can speak, please? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Hello, hello. 1, 2. 1, 2. Hello, hello. 1, 2, 1, 2. Hello, hello. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Brilliant. Okay.
Que hable él. You can speak, please? No, pero es que es europea, si no sería europea. Marc, ¿te llega? ¿Te llega audio de Zoom?
They're working through the tech challenges here.
¿Te llega? Sí.
And your video keeps cutting out. Why is that?
No.
Right. Great.
Excuse me, sorry. Could
You
say
can
something
speak,
to us?
please?
Because we need to run sound check.
Speak, please. Hello?
Hello,
You
can you
hear
hear
me?
me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. I think we're hearing you all.
Okay,
all
okay.
there.
Okay, okay.
Are we good then?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, okay.
That's me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hola.
I get
Sale
back
dos
to you
veces.
later
Sale
on.
dos veces.
Bye.
Sí, 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 sí.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming straight after lunch. I know it's siesta time, but I'm hoping we'll provide you with an interesting conversation. This is a very important topic. I'm really honored to be hosting this roundtable. My name is David Mills, and I'm based at the University of Oxford in the Centre for Global Higher Education. And I've been involved in drafting the academic background paper on mobility that is fed into the UNESCO statement for 2030. So it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be hosting such great participants for this roundtable. And I'm really looking forward to ensuring we can bring you into this conversation because it feels as if this is a really important topic for the future of higher education. If I may, I might want to ground us all for a second before we start. I'd like you all to just think for a moment about the role that educational mobility has played in your own lives. I know how much I benefited from international mobility, doing research trips as a student intern. I went to America to do a master's. I've been to many international conferences and organized a few of them. It's very much part of what happens in universities. But let's also think more practically. For those of you in the room who traveled to Barcelona, you've obviously been academically mobile. But did you struggle to get a visa? Did you have a problem with COVID tests? Last minute waiting for funding? Uncertainties about bureaucracies? I think those stories of mobility reveal how unequal mobilities can be. And there's also the question of how many of us chose low-carbon transport options or tried to offset our travel. I admit I didn't. And that's a theme I think I want us to explore today. So opportunities for and experiences of academic mobility are very unequal. In an unstable world, migration and unplanned mobility are increasingly shaped by geopolitics. We have to think about the refugee flows from Ukraine. Let me tell you a bit about this report that feeds into the Beyond Limits document and how we define academic mobility, because that's very important, really. And I'm using the UNESCO definition, which is physical or virtual movement of individuals outside their country for the purpose of studying, researching, and teaching. Physical or virtual. So let's start with physical. As you'll all know, there's been consistent, constant, and cumulative growth in international mobility, as with student enrollment in higher education. 2019, there were just over 6 million students studying abroad, a threefold increase in 20 years. And before COVID-19, these numbers were forecast to go up to 8 million by 2025. So why this growth? Well, it's obvious in some ways, isn't it? It's an opportunity to get high-quality international education, to access new skills, new labor markets. But it's also a chance to differentiate yourself from your peers. And post-pandemic, there's even more uncertainty about the opportunities for mobility. And the big question I think we all need to think about is, this is only 2.6% of all students. So mobility, especially international mobility, is a preserve of a privileged few. And of this small proportion, 40% of these students are coming just to 4 countries: America, Canada, Australia, and the UK. So this reinforces the dominance of an English language and creates other inequalities. Yes, of course, we're in a multipolar world, increasingly so, and there are new avenues of mobility. And we're going to hear about interregional mobilities and the ways in which these traditional patterns are changing. But as these new communities of students travel, mobility experiences will become more differentiated and perhaps more stratified. There's another problem, and that's the jumbo jet in the room, which is the climate crisis. How can we make the sustained, continued growth in physical mobility ecologically sustainable? Is it justifiable on grounds of equity if it exacerbates the social, economic, and educational divides between those who can and those who can't travel? And this is where we need to return to this definition, this inclusive definition of mobility as virtual. It was adopted by UNESCO in 2019 within its Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications. It recognizes the huge contemporary importance of distance learning and cross-border higher education, as we've already heard about in this conference. It builds on the second generation of regional conventions, all of which have helped make recognition, inter-university cooperation, and mobility a reality, including virtual mobility through distance learning. And I would also add here, of course, the European Qualifications Passport for Refugees and the UNESCO Qualifications Passport are an important part of the Global Convention, facilitating much-needed recognition for migrants and refugees. So, virtual mobility promises much. It potentially widens access to lifelong higher education, offers a diversity of flexible opportunities in a multipolar world, provides new opportunities for rethinking how we train our researchers and how we build links in research. It, of course, brings its own challenges of regulation and quality. It's a fast-moving market. It's a market increasingly with private providers that need careful assurance and building confidence around quality. So I think one of the questions for today is, what's the right mix of virtual and physical mobility? What's that going to look like in 2030? And I'm going to pose some big, difficult questions to my speakers, to my presenters today. But first, before I do that, I'd like each of them in turn to tell us a bit about themselves and then offer their thoughts on how the debate looks from their perspectives, and then we'll come back to the questions I'm going to pose. So I'll introduce them all briefly to start with, and then I'll ask Daniela to start. So Daniela, immediately here, Daniela Ramos is a PhD student in Education and Society at the University of Barcelona. So you're the local here. You're the local, but actually you worked for CineSup in Chile, a social enterprise that supports equitable access to higher education. And you also worked at the university previously of Santiago in Chile, supporting inclusion for student migrants, as well as carrying out research on international student experiences. So we couldn't ask for a better first speaker with that student perspective. And then after that, and this is a hybrid roundtable rather appropriately, our second speaker is Chika Sehole. He's a board member of the African Network for Internationalization of Education and Dean of the Faculty at the University of Pretoria, the Faculty of Education. Sadly, he tested positive for COVID just before leaving. So very frustratingly, he's joining us online. A very warm welcome to you, Chika. Thank you very much I know you're a bit under the weather, so doubly appreciations for joining us at this session. And then third, we will hear from Michael Harms. He's Deputy Secretary General of DAD, which is the world's largest funder, and I think promoting the international exchange of students and researchers. That's a German government agency. And then finally, but absolutely not least, Ethel Pascual Valenzuela is Director of CIMEO, which is a regional intergovernmental organization promoting regional cooperation and university mobility, both physical and virtual, across Southeast Asia. So I'm hoping that with this combination of experts and speakers and insights, we'll really be able to cover many bases. But of course, we then are going to welcome your comments and thoughts as well. So please do start scribbling down questions or issues that emerge. We'd really love to hear from you. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Daniela.
Muchas gracias, David. Bueno, como les comentaba.
Thank you very much. As you said, I'm Daniel Ramos. I'm studying a doctorate at the University of Barcelona and part of the board of the International Centre for Equity and Inclusion in Higher Education, CineSup. As David was telling you, I've been specializing in inclusion in higher education. I've been looking at the African context, Mozambique, South Africa, and lately I've been doing more research on migration and higher education and how policies for education in Latin America are responding to migration challenges. As you see, I'm speaking Spanish.
a la diversidad lingüística que podamos tener, digamos, en esta misma conferencia.
Taking advantage of the facilities. David mentioned earlier how our experiences have had an impact on each one of us is here and have marked our own approach to migration. I am very interested in mobility, as David has said, and currently I'm studying in a different country to my country of origin. I'm here in Barcelona, and I wanted to look at subjects pertaining to inclusion, particularly on the African continent, to see what inclusion may mean in the 21st century. So I think that these topics are highly timely, and we need to have a fundamental look at them. Also, and David mentioned this as well, these matters of mobility in higher education have recurred constantly throughout this conference. This is a sign of the world we live in. According to the IOM, in recent years, there's been a multiplication of the levels of mobility in the world by a factor of 3. Mobility has tripled. Around 10 years ago, there were about 2 million migrant students, and now there are around 6 million, according to UNESCO. So that, as I say, is a triplication. But my main interest is not just the figures in migration, but also taking a closer look at migratory flows and their particularities. I'm particularly interested in the Latin American context. If you look at it, in the 20th century, there was a great deal of migration from the south to the north. In America, it was generally citizens from southern countries, which tend to be underdeveloped or developing countries, says the speaker, and they tended to move northwards to other countries looking for a better standard of living. But these days, there's much more migration from the south to the south. In Latin America, we're seeing a great deal of migration within regions and within our own countries as well. And that's a change in the trends. And now, as well as so many people moving around, which has been a result of international economic crises and different political conflicts at different levels, and all of this has led in turn, in many cases, to a general atmosphere of instability and a new, if you like, attitude by nation states when it comes to dealing with the arrival of new migrants. There have been changes in the application of international conventions regarding the arrival of migrants and children among them. If you look, for example, at Spain, countries that traditionally were safe havens, relatively speaking, for migrants and for children, and they've tended to toughen up their requirements these days because of the impact on housing, etc. And it's not so easy to migrate into countries like Spain. So we have a new perspective now with regard to notions such as territory, nation, or citizenship. And this has led through to a new global situation. And there are new concepts being bandied around, such as transnational communities, migratory chains, transnational social spaces. And we need to look at migration in a framework of rights and also how it fits in today's world. This is a new paradigm. And against that backdrop, I think it's important to ask a question of what is the role played by education systems in the current context, in such a way that migrant people are actually able to exercise their right to study in higher education. I was particularly interested in looking at the Ibero-American, the Latin American situation. I think you have to recognise firstly there the important role that's been played by many states when it comes to bringing about the conditions so that children, boys and girls and teenagers can exercise their right to education. Many of these countries in that region of America have enshrined the rights of minors to go to school, irrespective of their migratory situation and what their family situation is, and this enshrined in their legislation. So new resources have been devoted to this, and this is something that we should be pleased about. But there are also difficulties. The problem that we're looking at is when there's a transition from school education to higher education. And in the Latin American, in the Ibero-American context, we find that there's a serious lack of public sector policies. We find that when boys and girls finish their school education and they want to start their higher education, they tend to face a very considerable volume of administrative and other kinds of obstacle, which makes it difficult for them. If we take Spain, for example, in 2017, 10% of the population was enrolled in school education at the national level, but only 2.3% of the population was enrolled in university education, in higher education. So there's a big gap there, and it's clearly very difficult for people to go on to higher education. There's a similar situation in Latin America. In Chile, for example, in 2021, school registrations accounted for 5.6% of the total, whereas university enrollments only represented 1.6% of the total. So this is a trend that we can see right across the Latin American region. It's quite difficult for children or teenagers to transit from school education to higher education within the public sector and with public sector support. Now, I'll be winding up now. If you look at these percentages of the population in higher education, it raises certain questions that we should be looking at, and there are no simple answers. We're obviously facing a number of challenges, and I'd like to point to 3 aspects that we need to consider when it comes to our perspective on countries in the region. Firstly, of course, there's clearly a lack of public sector policies and state and institutional programs supporting migrant students. Universities and states ought to consider migration as something that's basic when it comes to providing programs for access and financing of higher education. They do already provide for vulnerability, gender and ethnicity, but mobility, migration is still a much greater barrier when it comes to access to university studies. That's with regard to Latin America. And then in this post-pandemic period, David mentioned this, there's more scope for virtual or distance education. That has acquired a much more preponderant role in recent years. Many universities have hybrid or dual schedules, which will have a great impact on who can study, and that's not been analysed yet. And the last question is with regard to the paradigm change. We need to start understanding higher education as a right. It's very interesting to note how school education has become compulsory in most countries in the world, and the countries of the world have required that migrant students, pupils, should be able to go to school, primary and secondary school, in a way that is free access and protected by the state. And I think that higher education should be benefiting from a similar approach in terms of access. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I wish my PhD students were quite as on top of all the data. The data is really important because it shows, doesn't it, just how many inequalities there are in mobility and migrant access. So thank you, that's a great start. So we're now moving from from perspectives of Spain and Iberoamerica to Southern Africa. And I'm hoping that Chika is on the call still, and he's going to tell us a bit about his biography and about his current work in the African Network International Education. Chika, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to participate in this session. About the topic of this afternoon, let me say that I owe my participation in this conference to the opportunities I got in the early days of my career to move around the world. I did all my college education and graduate studies in South Africa. A year after my PhD, I got a postdoc fellowship to the US, where I spent 10 months at the Center for African Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. That was my first experience of academic mobility, which is about 20 years ago. This experience exposed me to three important values and opportunities presented by academic mobility that shaped my academic career later on. First, by being outside the country in the US, I was exposed to a rich literature on South Africa and the African continent, which was never accessible to me during my studies in South Africa as a result of censorship during apartheid. Secondly, during that year, I got connected to three leading scholars in my field of higher education specialty who helped me to be globally connected and assisted me to get published internationally. These opportunities would never have been available to me if I had not traveled. Thirdly, I got exposed to African scholars who inculcated the love and desire to learn more about other parts of the African continent. And when I returned back to South Africa, it was my desire that I want to travel the continent and know the continent, because under apartheid, the mobility of Black South Africans was quite restricted. A year after my postdoc experience, I got a Fulbright scholarship again to the US that connected me to 29 global scholars in the field of higher education. Under the leadership of Philip Oldbach, we conducted research on globalization and higher education, and I was part of a research group that focused on student mobility. The research group inducted me into the field and literature on student mobility, and I've been working on this theme ever since. The above account highlights important aspects of mobility, which include exposure to different forms of knowledge systems and traditions which transcend national constraints and censorship, opportunities for collaboration and partnership that have long-term benefits for evolution of one's career, path, and scholarship. And thirdly, research opportunities that help me develop one's niche area for research, which, as I said earlier on, would never have been realized if I never had opportunities for academic mobility. Upon my return to South Africa in 2007, I started getting involved in initiatives that led to the establishment of the African Network for Internationalization of Education, ANI. Through ANI, I got involved in intra-Africa research initiatives that aim to provide an understanding of the nature and forms of internationalization and how it finds expression in higher education in Africa. Through a number of research initiatives and projects that we undertook, the following were discovered: that there are many internationalization activities in African institutions or universities, and between African universities and the other universities, and those also in the global north. But these have not been properly documented to position Africa as an important global player in the space. Secondly, many African universities were involved in initiatives that contributed to the Millennium Development Goals, but these were not systematically documented to measure impact. In our last project on inter-Africa student mobility, the study which we conducted over a period of 6 years across 6 African countries, the study found that there are many African students who choose to study in another African country and another African university because of a particular university, because of the stature of the particular university which they chose to study in that country. Some of the factors that attracted these students to choose that country and that university include security issues, the friendliness and hospitality of the people of that country, the quality of education that was offered, religious reasons, and government support for one to study in that particular country. Regional mobility is very dominant in Africa due to economic reasons. But there are also students who choose to study beyond the borders of their own region within the African continent. And what is important is that some of the findings of that study of those 7 African countries is the fact that many of the students indicated that they did find quality in the country and in the institutions they were studying in. And contrary to popular views that many African students do not have plans to return to their homes, our study found that students had plans to return home and to contribute to the rebuilding and development of their countries. So as we study, we focus on the issue of academic mobility. I think there is more attention that needs to be paid to regions such as Africa that have been under-researched and where data is often said to be unavailable, but upon clear focus and groundwork being done to find answers to some of those questions, you will find that you come across data that can assist you to understand, but also to find answers to some of these questions, which when in most times, when they are asked, it is said that there is no data available in Africa, there is no data available in Africa. I think there is more effort that needs to be put in place to dig that data out, and it can be found. Thank you, David.
Chika, thank you very much for that. You couldn't be here, but the session before ours this morning was exactly addressing the challenge of data collection, and the points were highlighted absolutely that across Africa it's much harder to get robust higher education data. So I think it was great that you said this research is being done, there is the information that is being made available, but it's not as sufficiently made aware of. So I think your comments about your own journey, but also about the growth in mobility across Africa based on the quality of people's experience and, as you put it, the friendliness and hospitality of people in the countries of the host universities, that's all really important to know more about and document better. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Michael, we're back in the room, to speak from the perspective of Dad and perhaps also about the European perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And I'm really happy to be here because, talking about academic mobility is basically bread and butter of what we do. And as you said, I try to bring in the perspective of a funding organization, the DAAD, or German Academic Exchange Service. Maybe I can just say 2 or 3 sentences, who we are, what we do. We were founded about 100 years ago, and this was a student initiative, and we're still, very proud that until the present day we have students on our board, and deciding the policies of the DAAD. We are a membership organization of the German universities, so we're not governmental. However, all our funding is coming from German ministries and the European Commission, so we use government money. We have round about 200 programs going, and these are very flexible. We try to respond to current demand. Maybe I get the chance to talk to you about our Ukrainian package that we have just attended and that we just called for. These are scholarships for Ukrainian students who had to flee the country. or our Hilde Domin program, which is for students at risk, but I can go into that later. 2.5 million people we have supported and equipped with scholarships since the 1950s. So, David, you said there is, a growing demand for international higher education. There is also a lot of movement towards, international destinations, and I think we have to respond to this hunger for higher education. And why is academic mobility important as such? Our belief, our principle is that, it's only that working together on an international, on a global level, we will be able to meet the challenges that we all face. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and the vaccines have only, being developed so quickly because we were working together. We have the climate catastrophe, across the doorstep. And if we don't cooperate, if we don't work together, then we're not able to solve these questions. And this is why I am convinced that we need academic mobility and cooperation. Also on an individual level, it enables individuals, students and PhDs, postdocs to study and research at locations where they can unlock their potential, where they can develop themselves and get on with as scientific people. And last but not least, the exchange of ideas, approaches, and teaching is what science and research is all about. Providing opportunities is something else that you said. I'm happy that I got the chance myself to grow abroad. I went to the United Kingdom. I studied at the University of East Anglia, and that was really a life-changing experience, as this is the case for many, many thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who experience the same thing. And it's really a pleasure for me. Only 10 days ago, we had the first big scholarship meeting of about 500 people in Berlin, from people from more than 100 countries. And to see, how the scholarship, a study or research visit at a German university can change their lives is really very, very special still. I mean, I had the privilege to talk to many of them over the years, but I really, this is when I always realize how much I love my job. But I want to also talk about the social political dimension of academic mobility. International understanding and intercultural competences and all these things. If we look at Erasmus, for instance, I mean, this is probably the most successful individual program for the European Commission. And I think especially in times of rising populism and nationalism, we need more exchange, and this is, I think, why we're here to talk about it. There are limitations, sure, and sadly we have just, had to witness that, even when we have a very extensive collaboration in academia, for instance, with Russia, this is by no means a guarantee that wars and conflicts can be prevented. But I think we have to, be aware that this is not it's not a way to solve all the problems of the world. But I think we really need to contribute and work in the spirit of understanding and respect and trust. And I would like to talk about COVID and its implications, but maybe I'll wait until the next round.
Fine. Yes, that's okay. We can come back to it. That's a great starter. 2.5 million, that's quite some number. Yeah, that's very interesting. So we're playing with numbers here, but that's quite a lot of students each year that have benefited. Okay, so thank you very much, Michael. And we will certainly come back to, we'll certainly come back to questions of COVID and geopolitics, because I think you're absolutely right to raise that as something which is increasingly shaping higher education. So finally, definitely not last but least, Ethel Valenzuela, you are Director of CMAO, which is the Regional Intergovernmental Organization across Southeast Asia. Please.
Thank you very much, David. First, I would like to thank you for writing a very good paper on academic mobility in higher education. It's really a good paper. I hope you all have a copy of this. And first, on your request for us to share our experience on academic mobility. So for me, I reflected on my personal engagements on mobility, individual and personal. So in terms of my professional experience on academic mobility, I have to start with where I come from the Philippines, where my exposure is more on preparing policies related to academic mobility. So in early 1990s, we're able to develop our international practicum training program, an exchange program overseas for students who are in more or less senior level in higher education. And that is called IPTP, very popular at the time. I also was part of the Special Committee on Scholarship in our government, and we visit scholars all over, and many of them are in Japan, and they're doing very well, and some also in Australia and other countries in the region. So my experience is more of policy making. But when I joined CIMIO, it's more regional. We have 11 countries. So CIMIO represents Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, which was established since 1965. And, it's a policy-making body for regional cooperation in education, in science, and culture. So higher education is actually part of our main agenda. It's more on harmonization of higher education and supporting it with better research. So our work, actually, we have a Center for Higher Education, CIMIO RIHED, and that center is based in Thailand. We have 26 other centers spread all over Southeast Asia. And we serve 7,000 higher education institutions in our region, and 20% of population in the world is in Southeast Asia. If you combine Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, so we have a large number of higher education enrollees. And our work is more of promoting now, in the present, academic mobility and internship program. So we have selected subject areas where students can do exchange program, and I have to present these to the ministers and get the approval for all the projects and things we do. And recently, due to the pandemic, we have to call back all our interns overseas, and they don't want to come home. First of all, in 2020 January, we don't know what pandemic is, right? But it's hard for them to go back to their own country, right? Vietnamese should go back, and Thais and Filipinos, etc. But we closed down, we locked down even our academic mobility programs, and 2,000 students were on mobility. And what's good is that we're able to call them back, even those who are in Japan. And then we have to think, how do we approach academic mobility now and in the future? So we have tried to do summits after summits, and we now have a platform for virtual mobility. So the thing now is you have to reimagine the future. I don't think we are going to have, again, the physical mobility, but there will be hybrid mobility or a combination of both. And now we have the first batch of our virtual mobility students who are actually engaged in the process. So, and in my experience for personal mobility, for example, I'm quite old, so in the 1990s, my first youth exchange was in Japan. I really enjoyed it. And I have known the tradition, the culture, and the values of the people in Japan. And the second one was in the US. So I did I visited 5 or more universities, the best ones that I really have to open my eyes wide. Wow, Stanford or all other big universities. It's really like I'm in Southeast Asia, and then when you go to advanced countries, it's like many years behind for us. So it was an eye-opener, and the thing is that you have to get the lessons from that experience and bring it back to your country, and make sure that you contribute to human capital development when you return. So it's not just a trip, but rather giving back. And but this is more of professional work that we do, CIMIO, UNESCO. We cooperated on the mutual recognition of higher education qualifications. And then in 2011, the Tokyo Convention. So we're a team of writers for the Tokyo Convention, and now we need to do ratification of that. And in order for the Asia-Pacific countries to really go into recognition of higher education qualifications, so we need national information centers, and we also need the toolkit for the recognition of higher education qualifications. Our region is so diverse, you know, big countries, 400,000 people or 200 million people, and those with large higher education institutions and those with smaller higher education institutions. So it is not one size fits all. So there should be a toolkit, a guide for everybody. So I'm very happy that those are my involvement in academic mobility as you requested. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So the numbers continue to get bigger, 20% of the world's population, student population in Southeast Asia. You presented some important questions that I now perhaps wanted to seek into some difficult questions for my panel. Not too difficult, but some wicked challenges perhaps. And I think there are three that I'm going to pose. And in some ways this is linked to obviously how COVID seemed like a shock, but on the other hand, it was also a catalyst for things that were already changing. And universities were incredibly, many universities which were resourced enough could be very resilient at responding. And I think there's lots of lessons to learn from that. So I want my panelists to reflect a little bit about this question of, what are the challenges going forward? Firstly, with what's the future of physical student mobility look like? Given the environmental impacts, given the equity consequences. Can we mitigate those? Can we minimize those? What from your different perspectives does that look like in terms of the regions you know or the organizations you're working in? And then secondly, of course, as you've said, Ethel, which is this rise in virtual mobility. You suddenly shifted, but it's clearly growing. What does a hybrid look like? What's the best combination? And how might that vary by region? What is high quality virtual and physical mobility? How does that fit together? And what examples have we got of examples of that? And if you can, my final question really is thinking not just about student mobility in general, but also researcher mobility. And this, Michael, you can perhaps speak to particularly. Academic mobility is also about the mobility of researchers, doctoral training, research collaborations. And again, here, there are all sorts of potentials, I think, for virtual mobility, virtual supervisions, regional hubs. And so I'd like to find out what you all think about that as a way of changing the ways in which we train our researchers and ways we do research together. And you could argue that, given the costs of mobility on people's lives, if you're a researcher leaving your family to go and study in another country for a long time, might that also mitigate and soften the demands of physical mobility, perhaps creating more inclusive, more caring research cultures. So in short, what can UNESCO do to foster environmentally sustainable and socially equitable forms of international mobility and exchange? Now, you're not going to solve this in 20 minutes, but I would very much appreciate your thoughts. And if I start, Ethel, with you first, perhaps. Do you have any immediate reactions? So do you want to tell us a bit more about what worked well in terms of this sudden shift to the virtual?
Well, as I said, we have just developed the application for virtual mobility, and we're very lucky and happy because we have dedicated experts who provided support for this application in our website. And then we had already many institutions who are very much interested to go into virtual mobility. But it's not a one-way process, it's a two-way process. So we asked them first to tell us if they're interested to do virtual mobility. And they should have the data, they should have the technology to be able to participate. But I am in Southeast Asia, right? Not all universities would have the infrastructure support or access to all of this mobile data and everything. So I think, as you have mentioned, that those who are participating in virtual mobility are less than 10% or 20% of the population. Even in our region, we have actively engaged universities from Vietnam, from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia, and Thailand. Because this is in English, so not all countries or universities would be able to take part because it's an English internship program.
Okay.
So that's one. And we still have to develop another application to translate all the information into Khmer, into other languages. So that's another investment. But we invested on this so that we can continue with our mobility. What we do is that we listen to the students. It really helped them, and it's adding, more infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure into the different countries of Southeast Asia. If we don't support this one, we will not be able to learn from advanced countries. So we really need to support this one. But we're not finished. This is starting, Last year, we were totally closed. All the institutions said we will not take part in any academic mobility. And this one, I said, let's do virtual. Let's do this one. And they agreed to try. So maybe in the next forum, I'll be able to report, but it's an ongoing process, so we don't know if it will be successful or students will be bored. Everything is like, if you want to visit the university, you have to have a virtual reality or augmented reality, all of these. Wow. Virtual tour of the campus. Okay. And then, but you have to attend classes also online. So because this is internship, you will select classes that will allow you to learn in another institution online as well, do classes online. And what is important is that in this virtual mobility, we add project-based learning. So the only way to really support learning is PBL. And the project-based learning will be monitored by the mentors who agreed to take part in our virtual mobility program. So the major requirement is actually the infrastructure, that your university would be able to support this and that you're committed to complete the course. Our internship is only for 1.5 or 2 months, but it's still ongoing. It will be completed by June. Thank you.
Do you have any sense of whether there's an appetite for less physical mobility because of these possibilities, or is it just too early to tell?
Yeah, it's too early to tell if it is a preferred future of Southeast Asian higher education institutions. It's in a trial stage. Yeah. But of course, we would like to return to physical mobility next semester, perhaps in September. Okay. So this is just like, trying out if this will work. And maybe later on, we'll have 2 options. Yeah. You can have the face-to-face, and you can have the virtual academic mobility.
Or some mix of that.
Or hybrid. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ethel.
Thank you.
Michael, so the big questions, but do tackle them any way you want.
Thank you. Well, first of all, what was kind of fascinating to see that during COVID, of course, almost international travel broke down completely. However, that was not the case for the cooperation going on, and we found out that certainly in the projects that we funded, that researchers and students found ways and means to actually stay in touch and exchange data and exchange information, and that was very, very encouraging. So in many ways, of course, we, as you said, David, we saw that COVID has been a catalyst to these things. However, I think we should respond, and we have to make sure that we put a lot more effort into digitalizing our teaching and learning resources. And this is by no means trivial, I would say, because it is one thing to put up a PDF in the cloud, and another to really come up with a sensible, holistic, study course, completely digital. And of course, it has far-reaching implications with regards to pedagogy and other things. We have, and we started even before COVID, we have published several calls for German universities to help them with, developing those digital study courses and use them, within their international projects. However, there's of course a lot of challenges. How do we ensure quality in these projects? Certainly in Germany, there has not been a lot of experience with that because we are a non-commercial university system. We do not sell. German universities have not sold their digital classes as yet. There's a lot of problems with regards to legal framework. We found that it wasn't easy at all for us to award virtual scholarships, digital stipends for people who actually stayed in the country and follow a digital course. So that is something that needed change. And also, we haven't talked about digital divide, difficult problem with regards to hardware, but also to bandwidth and Wi-Fi. There is definitely a lot of potential that I think we haven't, made the most of yet. However, in my view, even if we look ahead and look at the future, hopefully after a pandemic, virtual mobility is a fantastic instrument to complement actual and real mobility, but I don't think that it can replace it completely, because what you really cannot substitute, I think, is the personal growth, the meeting of people and the building of trust. This is something I think you need actual mobility for. Can I just share one experience? In 10 years ago, we started with something that was novel then, which was a blended master course between two universities, one in Germany, one in Egypt. And the course was for professionals who wanted to go further on for an MA. And it worked in a blended way. So most of the teaching was actually done at home, in front of the screen. But they would meet 3 to 4 times a year. But then, is that the ideal way of combining it? Because it meant 4 times flying to Egypt or to Germany. And looking at it now, with a sense of ecological sustainability, we may have come up with other solutions.
No, the difficult question is the flexibility of part-time learning, if that means lots of flights. On the other hand, I had a student who was meant to be doing, I'm trained in anthropology, meant to be doing fieldwork in Japan. He did all his fieldwork online. He spent a whole year in the middle of the night based in Oxford. So it is amazing what's possible, but I think you're really right, Michael, to raise this question of what's lost, the sociality that's offered. It's a different form, isn't it? And as you say, is it as strong as a way of building trust and learning? And these are questions I think we're going to keep thinking about, but thank you. Chika, coming to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just want to indicate that I believe that much as I've spoken about the benefits of physical mobility, I need to indicate that it does not come cheap. The issue of one child leaving the country, leaving the family to another country to go and do research and so on, it's something that is costly. It takes a number of combinations that should make that possible. Firstly, when one leaves this institution, you've got to find replacement help, for the work which we are supposed to do. Secondly, you need to sustain yourself, in the country which you are visiting, which is something that obviously is not affordable from one's pocket. So there is need for sponsorship for that. Secondly, to sustain physical mobility in the future, but also to make sure that you redress some of the inequities that are there. There needs to be creation of a culture of regional and international collaboration and partnerships which will create awareness of available opportunities for equitable access to some of these opportunities. And donors will have to be vigilant in creating equitable chances of access to these opportunities, even amongst applicants from marginalized communities. It should not just be the privilege of those who have already gained access to some of these opportunities. So I also agree that physical mobility going forward will still be necessary. However, given the costs that are associated with it, not only in terms of dollar and pound, but also the cost of living one's family and so on, which might inhibit mobility. The issue of hybridity spells, it's a good option going into the future. And the COVID pandemic that imposed lockdown on us demonstrated to us possibilities that are available to achieve some of these goals of interactivity across national borders and achieving that virtually. In our institutions, I think Mr. Pretoria, during hard lockdown, because of the investment in the learning management system and infrastructure, we were able to offer teaching and learning to students over 140 countries. They did not have, because there was no contact at all. Before, the national borders were closed, students who could afford were able to leave the country borders to go to their homes, and we're able to provide, teaching and learning to learners over those many countries. And now with the recession of COVID pandemic, there is a gradual, return to contact teaching. But, the survey which we've conducted demonstrates that students are actually not all students are keen to return to contact teaching. They would like to have, continue with online learning, whereas there are some students who prefer contact teaching. So hybridity seems to be the future, and I think we should not throw away important lessons and gains which we made during the pandemic, and ensure that institutions become agile, they become adaptable, they become innovative, and become responsive to now the diverse needs of students who they are servicing. And at the same time, I think we also need to be responsive to the diverse needs of researchers. There will come a time when it's important for researchers to travel in order to work with their collaborators overseas, but virtual contact is also important. Just like at the moment, being unable to come there to Barcelona, but I'm still able to participate meaningfully in this roundtable. And this gives us opportunities to actually have an inclusive way of participation of people who would have otherwise not been able to be present or included in some of the projects that are cross-border. Lastly, there is also some important lessons to be drawn, from lockdown of the past. Even though research visits and physical travel to research and training sites were disrupted, but research in some cases continue to be conducted. Conferences continue to be hosted virtually. And from those experiences and lessons, I think there are opportunities for us to find ways in which we can respond to the need for mobility, either physically or online or in a hybrid form, in order to take forward the research and training agenda that is part of the agenda of higher education. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. It's great you're here, even if hybrid. And I have to say that hybrid does sound great, but I was teaching a course last term and it felt like I had 2 classrooms I was teaching at the same time, which is demanding, to say the least. But you're absolutely right. All these themes, we need to listen to what students' needs are and how they have to fit study into their lives. Perhaps then finally, Daniela, do you want to respond to some of these themes?
Sí, yo considero.
Yes, I think that what we're seeing in the COVID context is interesting because universities have had to move from 100% presence format to 100% online format. And institutions of higher learning and academics themselves and students have had to adapt to the new situation, the new context, and deal with this 100% virtuality. But this is a new way of understanding universities, new forms of communication, learning, using new methodologies, new pedagogical methods, and how to ensure that there is participation by students and determine their role. I think we've seen progress, but this may involve the use of resources which we didn't have before. Another issue was access to technological resources for students in a given context in rural areas. Students often don't have access to the internet or to technology, to devices, so this made it very difficult for them to exercise their right to higher education and continue their university studies. There are many universities which have also made efforts to provide equipment, broadband computers to allow students to continue to studying, but we also saw that there is a divide in terms of access to technology resources and virtual reality and learning in that context. So there's an opening up of a new opportunity on the one hand, a new way of understanding the university, but we're also seeing other gaps, major shortcomings in access to technology instruments. So we need to understand this progress in terms of technology globally and focus on the new reality for students, particularly in Latin America, but also globally. Another aspect which I think is interesting is that, well, now the pandemic seems to be coming to an end at least, we've seen a return to in-presence learning. Students, academics, the institutions have started to deal with this, and students can now attend in presence, but there's the mental health aspect, going from 100% virtual format to fixed hours and demands in terms of managing family life or life outside, ensuring mobility between home and work or home and study. This has an effect on mental health. And universities are moving towards more hybrid systems, or at least they need to, with a view to their future. So this is a new challenge in terms of how we understand education. I think we're facing a major opportunity now that we're in a really globalized world, and learning has to be adapted to this new global context and its new challenges. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Daniela. It's lovely to have your student perspective and to be really reminded that virtual mobility is also a driver of inequality as well in terms of access to those opportunities. So we've covered a lot of ground, but we still have a decent amount of time for your thoughts, for questions from the floor. I'm hoping we have a roving mic. I think we do. So please, why don't I take questions in threes? You can ask a question, you can say something. My only rule is that after a minute, I might politely say, please stop. Okay, but please, questions, thoughts, responses to any of our panel, most welcome. And we have an immediate hand here. Do we have a mic? I think we do, just coming. Oh, it's just there. Yes, perfect.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andy Gibbs. I've been involved in mobility programs probably for about 25 or 30 years in Europe, in Southeast Asia, institutional level and government level, and various initiatives. And when I first started, academic mobility was quite simply defined as if you spend more than one semester studying in an institution in a different country. Well, when I listen now, I'm beginning to wonder whether the term academic mobility is becoming redundant, because we're looking at horizontal, virtual, vertical, distance, hybrid. It seems to encompass so many things now that perhaps we should be thinking about mainstreaming the activity and focusing on the outcomes and the aims of academic mobility rather than just using that term, academic mobility. And I think if we did that, not only could we be more focused on what we're hoping to achieve, but we could also think of different ways to bring it to the probably 80% of students who will never be mobile. It's not really a question, I'm sorry, it's a point.
No, it's a really
but
brilliant
less than a minute.
Andy, thank you. No, it's a comment based on experience and wisdom. Before we come back to that, are there any other immediate questions that people want to raise? There's one over here.
Hello, thank you very much for the great interventions. I'm Juan, the president of the Erasmus Student Network. So we basically work supporting mobile students. Actually, I want to elaborate a bit more and kind of build on the intervention by the colleague. And I want to ask you actually, since we all know that one of the most valuable things of mobility are the things that you learn outside of the classroom as well, should we maybe consider measuring and evaluating those learning outcomes as well? This is something that happens in other kinds of mobilities, like youth mobilities, for instance, in the European context. But even though we all talk about the importance of intercultural learning, getting to know other cultures, we only evaluate the results in the classroom. Is there a way forward for us to also consider what our students are learning outside of the classroom? Which kind of competences are they acquiring? And any thoughts on how we could do this both maybe in the European context, but also in other contexts like Southeast Asia, or in general in the global level, or maybe if there is any process that UNESCO could lead in that regard? Thank you.
Well, that's two really interesting questions. I think, is there one more hand up? Yes, at the back. Sorry, you have a bit of a jog to get there.
Just a short question. Should the academic mobility in higher education be considered as an obligation for students and teaching staff, or should we continue with what we have been doing until now? I consider the academic mobility should be honestly a kind of somehow should be included in the curricula of the students and the academic staff. So as my colleague underlined, that would suppose also an increasing process of the budgets and so on. This is also the biggest problems we are facing with.
This is always the best bit of a seminar, when you realize the paper you'd written is actually much improved by all the audience's comments. So I'll have to go back, but thank you. Those three questions are great. I've got thoughts, but perhaps I'll open it to the panel. Does anyone want to weigh in on either this question around is the term redundant, and actually can we integrate it into everything we do? And then also this question of measuring the sort of non-academic outcomes of mobility.
Well, if nobody wants, I may go first. Well, of course, yes, our world has changed and academic mobility has changed. I think as simple as that. And I totally agree with you on, when I use the term academic mobility, for me, the ideal is still, as you said, to go out and spend, a significant amount of time in a foreign country, to be able to immerse into, a different culture and also a different academic environment. So I go along with you on that. However, I really think that our societies have changed, our life has changed, and we have to allow, for new technologies also to play a part within the context of academic mobility. And maybe there's one example. You said quite rightly that 80% of the students may not be mobile, okay, but we have to bring, internationalization to them on their campus. So, what has become known as internationalization at home, I think should play a role, because then we can expose those who are, for many reasons, may not be mobile. They may, have to look after family members. They may have, some personal circumstances that prevent them from going. And I think we have to keep them in mind too. If I may, just one sentence from my point of view, to the obligatory part of going abroad. Well, I don't think you can force anybody, and you shouldn't, be forcing anybody. However, I would go about it, the different way. We have a lot of study courses in Germany where you have, and you have in the UK as well, where you have windows for, going abroad. And I think that's the way to go about it. And to have also, close cooperation that allows students, not to lose anything, as it were, in inverted commas, with regards to time spent abroad. I think that's the better approach, rather than make it obligatory.
Great, thank you, Michael. Daniela, Ethan, would you want to respond?
Sí.
Responding to Juan's question, I think yes. If we have in mind this globalized planet and what mobility means for the higher education sector, we're going to have a paradigm change as well in the way in which we consider information and how it's conveyed to students. I don't think there's a single answer as to how to evaluate this, but there are certain weaknesses that need tackling when it comes to migration. We need to diversify what's on offer so that we can get through to people of different cultures, and having them means that we can get a new perspective and assess what we should be providing as higher education. It's important that higher education institutions should be able to tackle this and start evaluating more, broader skills than they used to, with just checking on the knowledge had been acquired, check that on other competencies. And mobility is ideal when it comes to broaching new perspectives and having new looks at old things. So it should assist us also in updating the way in which we evaluate what people have learned. This is applicable also to our university professors. They need to be trained to this end so that all of our academics know how to tackle this. There need to be particular skills imparted to them so that they can understand what's at stake when they're dealing with students who have come as migrants from another country. It's a bit delicate. You can't, of course, oblige anybody to become mobile and go to another country. but there's the possibility of having exchange programs. On the other hand, it's not easy. It's quite a challenge to go beyond one's borders and adapt to a new reality, a new culture. And this requires certain kinds of personal resilience that are not insignificant. And then there's the financial aspect as well, because one needs to be able to cover the cost of the study, of the movement and the studies. Some levels of higher education, students tend to have more access to financial resources than others, and there are those segments where very few have the relevant funds, and decisions can be made there to assist them. But I think it's important that universities should equip themselves with the tools to ensure that students who are migrants and wish to study are able to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. It's great to get your perspectives. That student perspective is really important. Ethel.
Thank you so much for the questions and interventions. I know Andy, thank you very much for that. So as you know, I think most of us are in reset mode or circuit breaker mode during this pandemic. That's why we would like to try out the virtual mobility. But going back to the question by our Erasmus colleague, I think from Simeo, because we are small, well, we have few members of these mobility programs. And we meet twice a year and we evaluate. We award outstanding students who went into mobility. They submit their blog. It's a requirement that they submit their blog of experiences and then video how the mobility program enhanced their own personal experiences. And I think we collected a lot of stories of students who went into the mobility programs. And sometimes I cry. For example, students who really felt it opened the door for them to have bigger and better future, like being employed in big hotels, those who are interns in hospitality and tourism management. We also have internship for teachers, and this is a pre-service teacher. So I want to add that in our teacher education exchange, which we call a C-teacher, it's embedded in the curriculum. So in your senior year, in your field study or internship program, you have a choice whether you do it in your own country or in Southeast Asia. So it's part of the curriculum, and the students have a choice. Those who wanted to go beyond the country, they have the opportunity with us. And these are all very rich experiences. Well, it's not a bed of roses. Whenever we evaluate every year, we have problems, a lot of problems. Now, our afternoon evaluation summit will not be complete without stories and challenges like resources. Of course, number one is resources. They cannot adjust to the country, the language, the food, it's so spicy, all complaints about their experience. But we don't stop because the ministers really wanted us to have strengthening of our intercultural understanding, better understanding of the ASEAN region. This is our region, and we need to work together. So most of our internship and academic mobility programs are intra-ASEAN. And it's because, the problems would be language, resources. We only had one problem about accident, and we realized we don't have insurance. So after that year, we have included a requirement for insurance for students when they go mobility. So we learn along the way. It's not always perfect, but we evaluate, we have blogs, we listen to their stories, and we give awards to them, and of course, awards to students and the universities who are participating with us. So sometimes we say that whatever bad things we hear from students, next time we'll make it better. So it's all lessons learned.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chika, did you want to come in on any of those comments?
Yes, I just wanted to comment on, I think that the issue of measuring, the non-academic, lessons that take place outside of the classroom is very, very important. In the intra-mobility, study which we conducted, our research did venture into that, and it came with, very valuable insights in terms of what the experiences of the students are in that country whether they were accepted or not accepted. Issues of xenophobia in some cases started, emerging. The experiences of students in terms of how they are treated on campus, outside of the classroom, on campus by other students, they yielded very rich information that can be useful to international offices on campus that can help to improve their policies as well as their practices in terms of how they deal and engage, with international students. So I think, I wouldn't say the measurement of that. I would say, capturing those experiences with a view to provide feedback to policymakers and practitioners, as well as, help to prepare the reception of international students into those countries and into those institutions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Joanna, it's an interesting question. Is in a world where we're already quantifying the self, does one quantify everything one does in a mobility experience, and what would that do to it as well? But you raised a really great question. And Andy, your comment about what we'll be talking about this in 10 years' time is interesting. I think you're right that we're loading this word with a lot. It might well be that 10 years' time it's less important. I'm going to ask for another round of questions, if that's okay. We still have just enough time for one more round. There's a hand here, please. Have we still got our mic? It's coming, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Romyen Gosaikanon. I'm actually the Center Director of CMEO Righthead. We are working under the umbrella of the CMS. And it's not the question, but maybe the sharing. CMEO Righthead also run a regional flagship mobility programs for about 12 years already. And during that time, it was before ASEAN integration come into place. And we are having this mobility program as a sandbox. We want to try out what works, what doesn't, in terms of higher education harmonization. Then when the COVID-19 hits, we realized that some of the things that we do doesn't work anymore. And what we are trying to do then is that we want to reinvent or actually revisit the mobility program that we have. But in doing that last year, because we have the ASEM, we're also working under the ASEM framework as well. So we organized the workshop, and we want it to be really inclusive. And we take the concept of co-creation. So we are working with EU delegations. We are working with Thai government and also British Council and the British Embassy in Bangkok. And what we come up is that what we are doing in certain things doesn't work anymore. Disciplinary-based mobility may not be the way forward, because we have to think about mobility that is happening in amidst multiple crises that we face. Climate change. You cannot have one discipline that fixes everything. It has to be multidisciplinary. Like Andy said, so it has to be value-based. Instead of thinking about one semester mobility programs, 3 or 9 credits, we should be not thinking about that anymore. It doesn't work anymore. So what we are trying to do is that we are learning also from the EU. So we are trying to work with the EU share, try to come up with the programs so that we revisit whatever is still hurdles and the obstacles. So this year we would have 3 workshops, working together with the government in Southeast Asia and also the government in the EU and some selected universities. And we are trying to co-create a new mobility programs, whereas the old model is still there. We are trying having a sandbox so that let's see whether it's future-oriented, it addresses the issues that we are facing, and also making sure that it's resilient and adaptable for the future, that we don't really know what is happening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So these experiences are really important to share, and I think the Erasmus experience and the European experience of mobility is one that I think the other regional conventions will also be learning from. So there's another question here, please.
Thank you for the interesting panel discussion, roundtable discussion. I am Dr. Manisha Ramesh from Amrita Vishwavidyapeetham from India. Very happy to see the good discussion about the academic mobility. But if we look at the diversification needed and also to make sure that no one is left behind, I think virtual mobility is another major aspect the academic institutions to take up. But I think today the institutions are not ready with the pedagogical changes required for that. At Amrita, we have tried out this method with respect to a program called Live in Labs program, where we send the students to the villages to look at what are the challenges in the rural communities and then build sustainable solutions. And we worked with our partners from University of Manchester, from Ryerson University in Canada, where the students, being at two different parts of the world, work together and co-developed solutions, where few of them may work on hardware side, few of them may work on software side, some may be on the social side. But it has been a very bigger learning experience on how the pedagogical change has to be brought in. So I think there needs to be a capacity development among the institutions, how this learning experience can be changed, how the world around the learning and the teaching pedagogy approaches needs to be changed. I think there has to be a complete revamp and thought process is necessary for this change to bring in so that we can move forward with no one is left behind. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. You raised so many important questions there. There's lots to do, as ever, as universities change. Is there one more question or comments? There's a hand here. Okay, two more.
Yeah. Good afternoon, I'm Aldrin from the Philippines. I just want to ask if there is a possibility for UNESCO to come up with an outcomes framework in terms of the things that we did in the past in terms of academic mobility. I'm referring to the pre-pandemic academic mobility framework so that there's a possibility for us to compare pre-pandemic with the new normal academic mobility. I'm also concerned with what could be the possible evaluation framework and monitoring framework that we need to put into the forefront of this academic mobility. So that's my second concern. The third concern, will there be a possibility? I know Dr. Ethel is very much active with academic mobility within the ASEAN region. Will there be a possibility for UNESCO also to engage in a study that would compare ASEAN academic mobility framework vis-a-vis the non-ASEAN academic mobility framework, and that includes Western countries, engagement of the Western countries, and engagement of the Eastern countries, so that we can properly compare and contrast different attributes of the Western and the Eastern academic mobility programs. Thank you.
Great. I think you're raising a really important question, is what we can learn from the regions and comparing across regions. There was one more question. Hand, am I allowed to ask one last question, or I'm being told that I can't? Yeah, sorry. You can come and talk to us afterwards, please. If you want to follow on these conversations, these have been great interventions, and I think there's things to take away for the different regions here. My participants have been great. They each have about 20 seconds to say one last final thing. Ethel, you want to start?
Yes. Thank you very much. I think we're very lucky in Southeast Asia because we are in the region where we promote ASEAN connectivity, ASEAN integration. So we promote intra-ASEAN collaboration, and that can be achieved through youth exchange, academic exchange, and really understanding one another. But what is also very great is that we are connected to APEC, Asia Pacific International Cooperation. We also have mobility program under APEC. We have credit transfer scheme. We have guidelines on cross-border education provision. And we also work with European Union, with DAAD, British Council, and of course, the Secretariat is in Indonesia. ASEAN, European, all the information are there, credit transfer, comparison, and even the platform. Way forward is, we continue this partnership and we recommend to UNESCO. Great. Sorry for my long
No, it's fine. I think you're raising the Global Convention is beginning to connect these connections, which is great. Mm-hmm. Michael, 10 seconds, I'm afraid.
Okay, I have to concede that we did not answer the question, what hybrid, high-quality virtual and physical academic mobility look like, but I would say that there's a huge potential, especially when it comes to preparing beforehand and making sure that there's actually, a successful physical mobility.
Brilliant. Chika, very quickly.
My participation in this session demonstrated that we can overcome the constraints of physical mobility.
Well said.
And I think as higher education, we need to find ways in which we can, in the midst of inequalities that are there between institutions and regions, find ways in which we can develop an inclusive way in which various sectors of the higher education system can meaningfully participate in opportunities that are available. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming in online. And Daniela, you have less than no time at all, but please.
No, yo sé. Solamente mencionar.
Well, I'll just say that the relevant report in 2018 has a study on growth and migration. That was before the pandemic, but it might be interesting, that 2018 report, when it comes to comparative studies, although it's a pre-pandemic report. Thank you very much for this initiative. I think that this has been a good opportunity for us to go on looking at and trying to improve the conditions for students and teachers in higher education. Thank you.
It's great to give the students the last word. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's been a very good session.